predators, disease, brutal winters, hit by cars. There's very few ways that they die. And, if you think about it, a quick arrow or a bullet tends to be, it might be tough to say, but it's actually a pretty humane way to go. And with that too, the whole point of this conversation too is, we're talking about ethical hunters, and most hunters abide by the rules, the regulations, and they are ethical hunters. The vast majority are. And, they're not just going to be out there firing off rounds if they see an animal, and they're not just going to fire off at will. Hunters are waiting for the right shot, because it feels worse than if a hunter takes a shot and they think they hit it, but they didn't get it they didn't kill the animal, or it's going to die way later. They feel there's a real connection to feeling just terrible inside. And I think people don't realize that a lot, that there is a spiritual connection that you'll have with the animals. And with that, the idea of being cruel to the animals is actually the last thing that they want. Most people will say if they don't have the shot, they're not going to take the shot. And I think that's an important element to touch on. But all right, great. Moving on. Misconception number 3 that I have written down here. Hunting leads the hunted animals to extinction.
Yeah, so there we go again with the North American conservation model and this regulated approach to wildlife management. So hunting from a wildlife management standpoint, if we're talking about the science and art of managing wildlife populations sustainably, because they're a public resource, we hold these things in trust for us and for future generations. And so with that becomes this sustainability kind of responsibility that we have. And in that, James, there's this situation where, that kind of just by default means that we need to protect populations for the future. We only take what we can use, but we leave plenty of populations there to flourish in the future. So, the extinction part of it, I'm going to say as cleanly as I can, what typically leads species to extinction is not hunting. It's
poachers.
It's habitat. Yeah, it's. I was going to say habitat
degradation
sure. And fragmentation. So, if we are screwing with habitat, if we are fragmenting natural habitat, that's probably the biggest threat. If you look at like the Endangered Species Act, you look at species of greatest concerns in state wildlife action plans. Every state's got one. Most of that stuff is habitat driven. And so that's not being driven by hunters. That's being driven by development pressure and, just modern, the way we live, right? The choices that we make, how we expand our footprint. So that's an important distinction to make in the terms of that. And so there were cases, in the 1800s, we've all heard about passenger pigeons. That's a different model. Okay. That was before all the great regulations and all the protections that we have in place through the 20th century that prohibit wildlife meat from being sold commercially, for instance, like through the Lacey Act in the early 1900s. We have things like the Migratory Bird Act. There's just all sorts of protections in place that will protect those wildlife populations. Hunting is a tool. It helps manage those populations to maintain what's called carrying capacity for the landscapes that they live on. But it's not the driver of extinction at this point.
Sure, and that's a really good thing to touch on, that hunting is a tool and it helps maintain the population, because if it gets overpopulated, what's going to happen? You're going to have a lot of, unfortunately, really brutal deaths by a lot of animals out in there if the landscape can't sustain the amount that are out there. Moving on to number 4 that I have written down here. Hunters are poachers. So going back to what I mentioned before, I was hoping that was going to be like the perfect transition to my next one. But a lot of people see hunters as poachers, and I think that's I mean, yes, there are lawless poachers out on the planet who don't obey the rules and regulations, and the conservation efforts that exist that ethical hunters do obey. But what are your thoughts when you hear that?
Well, the most succinct thing I can answer to that is poachers aren't hunters. I'll turn
Sure.
it around. That's the most succinct way I can say it, James, in terms of that and how I feel about it. So in terms of just there's a lot of people with a conservation ethic out there that obey the law, that stay within the bounds of what they're supposed to do with their hunting licenses and the seasons. And so the poachers, there's definitely people out there that will push the limits. And in my eyes, they are not good for hunting. They're not good for wildlife populations. And, there's repercussions for that. There's a reason we have laws. And if, I just don't have a lot of space for people that poach.
Sure. Yeah, I feel
Yeah.
the same way. And I'm actually I'm a pretty punk rock person by nature. There's only a few times where I say, you know what, the rules make sense. I always say the rules of the road when you're driving, obey the rules of the road because they work. And I also say obey the rules of hunting because they work. And I like that poachers aren't hunters, so they shouldn't be put into this same category. Sadly, to many people, they are. But I think that what we're talking about today may change that thought process and conversation for a few people listening here.
Mm-hmm.
All right, number 5: hunters destroy public and private lands. What's your thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, so any recreational use has footprints, and so we can look beyond hunting to think about how we impact lands, both publicly and privately, right? We're having this huge conversation in the high peaks, for instance, that's beyond hunting about use in the high peaks
Mm-hmm.
and how to manage all that and all the traffic on the trails and the parking and the garbage and everything else, right? So there's just this part of this that whether people are engaging in the outdoors through hunting or whether they're engaging in it through hiking or camping or whatnot, there's always going to be a small percentage of people that don't understand the whole leave no trace ethic, right? But I can say through personal experience that the hunters that I associate with, it's been an opposite kind of thing. Like, I try to have a small group. Maybe we're a minority and I'm just kind of blinding myself to that. But I can tell you, if you like state public lands here in New York, we have done numerous cleanups where, we are going out. And I say we as a volunteer, for instance, through Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, a state chapter. Monty's Bay up in Lake Champlain, Kings Bay up there. We did a public land cleanup over in Hague near Rogers Rock campsite where there was this illegal shooting range going on. And so my experience has been quite the opposite. Is that the people, at least that I aspire to be like, are the ones that are out there cleaning up and just trying to make it better for everybody else. But that said, I see a lot of trash out there, and I see people throwing as much trash out their windows in their cars still, unfortunately, as I do of people that associate that with particularly hunting in specific.
Sure, and I always say this on the podcast or on social media, some people just can't be saved. It doesn't matter what you do. There's always going to be people who just don't care. And it will be up to us, the ones who do care, to just say, okay, I'm going to pull double my weight. And it's not about the other people. It's about the fact that I love these woods, love these mountains. So I'm going to pull the extra weight for the mountains, not for the other people, because the mountains deserve it, the woods deserve it, and that's just what we do. So that's kind of how I take that subject. But moving on, number 6, hunting is just for showcasing and sport. What are your thoughts on that subject?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've touched about that in terms of how people are coming into hunting in terms of thinking about their food and their agency with how they procure it. So there's definitely a shift in why people are hunting in terms of just thinking through. It's beyond what's called the trophy, for instance. I think the misperception around the trophy hunting is as much to do, I think optically hunters that I know that work really hard and they hunt all season and maybe they shoot a deer, I see a lot of pictures of those harvest pictures. And I think the context is that oftentimes hunters are communicating to other hunters, and not necessarily thinking about the impacts of how is somebody that's not hunting viewing this picture? Do they think that it's all about the antlers on the wall? Those are questions that I challenge my hunting friends about, because I think it is important. And I think it's like, what message are we sending here? So, definitely you see a lot of enthusiasm and appreciation when people are successful and they harvest an animal, and they wanna let people know that they've done that, especially their hunting friends, because their hunting friends get how much time, how much hardship they've gone through to do all of that stuff. It takes, especially in the Adirondacks, it could take all season, and you may only see a couple of deer, and you could spend every single weekend out in the woods for hours and hours and hours. So I hope that answers the question. I think that that there's a wide variety of reasons people hunt. There is, I think, some satisfaction with being able to look at a set of antlers and remember that experience. But for my hunting friends, I would say that if you're not hunting and you just see those pictures, there's no context. If I'm the public and I don't hunt and I just see a picture of a big rack, or I see somebody holding the rack, I'm going to have a different perception of that than if I were a hunter and I knew what went around on all that. So I think it's something that both sides can learn from. That's my takeaway on that one.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head there. People don't tend to know what exactly went into harvesting that deer. Let's say, for let's use this as an example. I mean, yeah, sure, you could go downstate, set up a lawn chair in a field, and you'll have the time of your life really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could hunt in the Adirondacks and, just like you said, hunt all season, all weekends, every weekend, and maybe see a few deer, let alone actually harvest one. So there is so much work that goes into it, and I think if you're not involved in hunting, or you're not in a circle of people who do go hunting, you don't see the amount of time that goes into that process. And yeah, I would agree that the antlers on the wall, it is exactly that. It's like a tangible way to remember the work that went into that. You could call it a trophy, though I guess like the word trophy kind of has a negative connotation in this subject matter. But that, I mean, bottom line is that's really what it is. But it doesn't have to be negative because of the fact that what we're saying, that it's showing how much work went into. And yeah, sure, they have a freezer full of meat that's going to feed them for the next year or half a year. So that's another tangible item. But I do think, yeah, I think you really nailed it. That represents the work that went into it. It's kind of like, people like hiking for patches, and you get a patch, and what the patch, no one cares about the piece of cloth, but what the patch does is it represents all those memories and all the fun and all the hardship that you went through hiking these mountains and these mountains over here and these mountains over there. And it's a tangible way to remember that. And going back to what I've mentioned before about, I also remember in my hunter ed course, they mentioned about taking pictures of the animals is to be very cautious about it for that exact reason, because if you post this bloody picture on your social media, to most people it's actually going to be detrimental to the cause, in a sense, because exactly what you touched on, that people might not know the context and they'll only see it as, how dare you slaughter that animal out there while it was just walking around. But that is something to keep in mind for sure, that there is a whole story behind that photo and behind that rack on the wall that could be a very fascinating story and an interesting story, and it's worth understanding that you might not always have the context, so maybe not be quick to jump to conclusions on that. But that was a great answer. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, you're quite welcome. And your comments there too, the analogy I think was perfect. Like we're talking about the patch, for instance, and it's symbolic, right? It's
exactly. That's what it is.
That's exactly what it is. So I really appreciate that.
All right, here's one. Listen up, people. Here we go. Hunting